Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Santos, and welcome to this podcast. Today, I will be discussing and explaining some topics that are related to psychology. We'll be talking about conditioning and the two main types, which are classical and operant. We'll be talking about some concepts that are related to research and why they are important. And I'm going to talk about two experiments that are related to psychology and what the results were. So let's start with the first point. So the first on the list is classical conditioning. And this is a process where a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus in order to get the same response. So to better understand this, we need to explain some concepts. First, we have something called unconditioned stimulus that will elicit an unconditioned response. And this is something that we don't learn. A good example of this is if you show food to a dog, this will start to salivate. The food is the unconditioned stimulus and the salivation is the unconditioned response. But there is something called conditioned stimulus that will elicit a conditioned response. And this is something that we actually learn. So how do you get to learn that? So you have to pair the unconditioned stimulus with something called neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus is a stimulus that don't elicit a biological or unconditioned response at first. For example, ringing a bell. Ringing a bell won't start or won't make the dog salivate. But if you pair this neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, the dog will start associating the bell ringing with the food. So whenever you ring a bell, now the dog will start to salivate, even if there is no food in front of the dog. Also, there is something in classical conditioning called extinction. And this means that if you stop presenting the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus, there will be no more conditioned response. And it's also interesting that individuals tend to respond differently to various stimuli that are similar. For example, the dogs, they usually salivate when you ring the bell that they use for the experiment, but if you use other kind of bell or if you use other sound, they won't salivate, and that process is called discrimination. Of course, you can use classical conditioning in therapy. Some good examples are aversive therapy and exposure therapy. In aversive therapy, you can use an unpleasant stimulus to stop an undesirable behavior. It's usually used to stop addictive behaviors. For exposure therapy, they seek to change the conditioned stimulus in a way that the client gets used to it. So the next thing on the list is operant conditioning, and here individuals learn to associate a behavior and its consequences. So this is based on the law of effect. There is reinforcement and punishment, and they both can be either positive or negative. And this means that positive means that you add something, and negative means that you take away something. So the target behavior is followed by reinforcement or punishment depending on what you want. If you want to strengthen or weaken the behavior, so that the learner is more likely to exhibit the desired behavior in the future. And there are some examples for this. For positive reinforcement, so if you go to work, you show up, you're going to get paid. And because if you get paid, you're going to keep going to work because you want to keep getting paid. And for negative punishment, if your kid is misbehaving, you can take away their toy and they will stop misbehaving. But there is also positive punishment, and this is when you add something in order to stop a behavior. A good example is when a police officer gives you a ticket. They give you a ticket for speeding or for passing a red line. They give you that in order to change your behavior and make you stop passing red lights or speeding. Okay, now I'm going to explain two concepts that are related to research, and they are reliability and validity. So, reliability refers to how consistent the results of a study are. So, if a study is reliable, it means that if somebody repeats the study, they would produce similar results. For example, if a weight scale is reliable, it will give the same weight measurement for a person every time it is used, as long as the conditions are the same, of course. This is important because it ensures that the results obtained are not due to change, but they reflect a true relationship in the study. Now, validity in research refers to how well a study measures what it claims to measure. So, if a study has high validity, it means that the study is accurately measuring the concept or phenomenon it is designed to measure. A good example is like if a study is designed to measure the effects of a new medication on reducing symptoms of a specific medical condition, the study must be able to demonstrate that the medication is actually responsible for the changes in the symptom observed, and not some other factors. We also need to define what an operational variable is. And it basically is how you define and measure a variable that is used in your study. And it's usually used to translate abstract concepts such as happiness or anxiety or mood. For example, if a researcher wants to study the effect of exercise on mood, they might operationalize mood by using a questionnaire that asks participants to rate their level of happiness or sadness on scales of 1 to 10. And by operationalizing variables in this way, researchers can ensure that their study is replicable and measurable, and that their results are based on observable and objective data rather than just opinions. And it's also worth noticing that there are some bias that can affect the results of your study. Here are some examples, like illusory correlation, which is seeing relationship between two things when there is no such thing. For example, like in summer, when you see an increase in how much ice cream is sold, and also an increase on crime, and only because they both increase, it doesn't mean that there's a correlation there. Also, confirmation bias, a tendency to ignore evidence that disproves ideas or beliefs, and you just focus like on the evidence that proves your ideas. Experimenter bias, where researcher expectations skew the results of the study. And there's also participant bias, when the participant expectations skew the results of the study. So now we're going to talk about two experiments that are related to psychology. And these are the Milgram experiment and the Little Albert experiment. So for the Milgram experiment, people were asked to give electric shocks to another person. So the shocks got stronger and stronger, and the person getting shocked acted like they were in a lot of pain. Even though the people giving the shocks didn't want to hurt the other person, they kept doing it when they were told by an authority figure. This experiment showed that people can be influenced by authority figures even if it means doing something that they don't want to do. So of course, the hypothesis of Milgram's experiment was the ordinary people would obey an authority figure and administer increasingly powerful electric shocks to another person, even if it caused them harm when instructed to do so. In this experiment, the independent variable was the level of authority of the person giving the order to administer the electric shocks. The independent variable was manipulated to test its effect on the dependent variable, which was the level of obedience shown by the participant as measured by the maximum voltage of shock administered to the learner. The results of Milgram's experiment showed that the majority of participants were willing to administer electric shocks to another person up to the highest level, despite the apparent pain and distress of the learner. More specifically, 65% of the participants administered the maximum voltage, even when the learner appeared to be in extreme distress. This level of obedience was surprising and unexpected, as most people would have predicted that only a small minority of participants would be willing to administer such high levels of shocks. The second experiment is known as the Little Albert experiment, and it was conducted by John Watson in 1920. This study involved conditioning a baby to fear a white rat by pairing the rat with a loud noise that scared him. Watson also wanted to know if this fear response would generalize to other furry objects, such as a rabbit or a cat or a dog. The study showed that it is possible to create a fear response in a child through classical conditioning, and this fear response could generalize to other similar objects, such as the rabbit or the cat. The hypothesis of this experiment was that a fear response could be conditioned in a child through classical conditioning. The hypothesis also suggested that this fear response could be passed to other similar objects, which was tested by presenting little Albert with furry objects other than the rat. The independent variable in this experiment was the pairing of the white rat with a loud noise, and the rat was constantly presented with a loud noise until the rat alone was enough to elicit the fear response. The independent variable was manipulated to test the effect on the dependent variable, which was the fear response exhibited by little Albert in the presence of the rat. The results of this experiment showed that a fear response could be conditioned in a child through classical conditioning. Little Albert, who initially showed no fear towards the white rat, began to exhibit a fear response, including crying and attempting to crawl away when presented with the rat alone, after it had been paired with a loud noise. Also, little Albert's fear response generalized to other furry objects, such as a rabbit or a dog, indicating that the fear response had become associated with a broader category of stimuli. Psychology is a broad field that has various branches and subfields, and some of the main branches of psychology are cognitive psychology, humanistic psychology, behavioral psychology, and biological psychology. So for cognitive psychology, this is the branch of psychology that studies how people think, how they remember and solve things, and it also focuses on the mental processes such as language, memory, and even decision making. Humanistic psychology is a branch of psychology that emphasizes the individual's potential for personal growth and self-actualization. It focuses on understanding and exploring human experiences such as love, creativity, and spirituality, rather than just behavior. Humanistic psychologists believe that people are good and strive to reach their full potential. Behavioral psychology is a branch of psychology that focuses on how people's behavior is shaped by the environment and experiences. It examines how people learn through their interactions with the world around them. Behavioral psychologists believe that behavior is a result of conditioning, which involves learning associations between a stimulus and a response. Biological psychology is a branch of psychology that studies the relationship between the brain and behavior. It explores how the brain functions and how it influences behavior, thoughts, and emotions. Biological psychologists examine the structure, function of the nervous system, and the role of neurotransmitters and hormones in behavior. Biological psychology has contributed to our understanding of mental illness, addiction, and the effects of drugs on behavior. It has also led to the development of treatments and therapies that target the biological mechanisms underlying these conditions. And the last point is actually a question, and it's, how can you use what you have learned in this class in your future? Well, I personally believe that psychology can be applied in many fields, such as healthcare. And personally, I'm interested in the healthcare area. So I think for healthcare professionals, psychology is very important because it can help healthcare professionals understand how patients think, how they feel and behave, and which is crucial for providing effective care. So it's also effective communication is critical in healthcare, and psychology provides healthcare professionals with the tools and knowledge to communicate effectively with patients and other healthcare professionals. Also, last but not least, mental health. Psychology is particularly important in the area of mental health. Healthcare professionals must be able to recognize and diagnose mental health issues. We should be able to provide appropriate treatment and understand the impact of mental health on physical health.